So Iksha, do you want to talk about your dissertation work a little bit?
Or even I think maybe to start from what we were talking about on our way here, which is that this morning when you guys went and knocked on 30 doors and we didn't have a single participant, but that idea that is part of the field work, right? Is that the last study that I had planned, and I go from here and I have this time in the summer and I plan my plan, but then it never works out that way. I always end up extending, because then when you actually get there, everything changes, which is actually that fact itself. You might have set up an interview, you might have planned something, but you go there and you wait the entire day and nobody shows up, or that even if they do, they just not in the mood to have a conversation or talk. And these are not even like cold knocking on doors that they were doing. This is like planned in terms of actually people that you know, but it's never say I have 15 days, or it never turns out to be 15 days. It ends up being the entire summer. And even then, even if I get one interview, and I guess that also relates to conversation that Daniel and I had recently about how do you even start an interview, right? So when do you even begin when you have somebody and you just meet somebody and there's idea of trust involved, and especially if you're talking about sensitive issues, where does it begin? And for me, what I think has worked is that, of course, I have my list of questions, but I don't, but it's not my Bible, right, in that sense, and it really is something that I have in my head, and this is what I want to achieve, but then I never let that be sort of, limit me in any way, because sometimes I don't get past the first question, and it really spirals off to a conversation, and that for me is partly because I'm a true believer of listening, right? And listening not in the sense of trying to figure out when I can ask the next question, but listening to what the person is actually saying and responding to them, and the conversation inevitably turns into a different thing that you plan. And then you always think, oh my God, I have this many questions, all right, what does that happen for the data, because how is that going to fit? But I never ever think about those things, because everything will find its place. It really depends on actually when you come back and you look at it and you think about it and you try to make sense of it. And at least for CCA, right, the idea is that you are in a continual conversation with your participants anyway, so it doesn't matter that it didn't go the way I planned. It never goes the way I planned. But having said that, right, I always go with a plan. It doesn't mean I just show up and say, because I like today, right, I have no plan. I'm like, oh, let's talk about, but I know, right, because this is something I do. But if this was still, Mohan said, let's go do an interview, right, I would still, at that moment, try to go in with the plan, which is that who am I talking to, what am I going to talk about, what is it that I'm going to ask, what is it that I'm trying to find out. But then you go in and then you talk to the person. And sometimes, it's particularly for women, and especially when I was working with the sex workers, it is that it ends up being my story, right? I have to be the one who sort of initiates that through not a question, but really in terms of my purpose, who I am, or where I come from, and what it is. And right, for you guys who've been in the field, that I can wear a traditional clothing and go in there, but it doesn't matter. It is a facade, right? They can see the way I talk, the way I, ask questions, the way I am, that I clearly am different. So the question is, do you try to hide that, or do you bring that? And I always bring that with me. And this is something that I have learned, I think, through multiple, is that, it's the idea of trust is also transparency. Right? Then if you are not transparent in who you are, not only so there's transparency that I tell you what my research objectives are, but transparency in terms of who you are, right? And that ties into how you think and the questions, and maybe even how you respond to the participants. And so so it's like I have a plan, but I really allow each person to drive that conversation, and it might be that sometimes, right, I haven't, but I come out with amazing stories. In the end, because I respond, I ask, I talk, it's just a matter of nodding and really trying to get them to just say, I hear you, right? And so it really, it's, in some ways, it's personality, I think, right, in terms of how we are able to be in the field, because it might anger you, it might be really annoying in terms of what they're saying, because you just think but then that's not your place. You're not there to judge. In fact, they are also judging you. It's just that they don't say it, right? And their judgment is what builds the trust. We are both judging each other, but then the idea is that if you place that judgment and you somehow, and it's sometimes I didn't say anything, but then think about your body language. I think about your expressions. It all communicates to them whether you are in any way, right, really not feeling what they are saying. Then the conversation is never going to be what you want it to be. So it's one thing in theory, but in principle to be able to. So I've when I sort of think, oh, next summer I'm going to go and data collect, and I've stopped saying how long I'm going for, because I say, okay, I'm going. That's it, right? I go, and then sometimes I have one interview, sometimes I have none, and sometimes I have 5. And what I've realized is that at least for interviews, sometimes it just takes one person to really believe in you or trust you, and then you start to build a network.
Yeah.
And it's that, and sometimes you're lucky to get that person right at the beginning, and sometimes you've gone through 30 interviews and you finally find that person who is able to say and attest to you, and then your field work really begins in terms of the data that you're looking for, right? But then not to discount everything that has happened. It will have its own place when you do it, but maybe that wasn't what you were doing, and there's not a magic number, right? We say saturation reaches at 35 or what, but there's no magic. Sometimes it's 1 and sometimes it's 50.
So part of this is the uncertainty in the beginning of fieldwork.
Yes.
And the idea behind that, then, what you're capturing is the notion of labor in fieldwork. When you see a CCA study, you do not see the labor that goes on behind the study, in the back rooms and in the back work. And part of that, I think, each of what you're capturing is the idea of character. My character as a researcher and your character as a researcher is represented or reflected in this notion of not giving up, right? So you knock on 30 doors, spend 2.5 hours, and you don't get a single interview. So what? Big deal. All that means is that one has to go back in again and knock on 30 more doors. And all those 30 more doors might be unknown. And that means that you go back to the next 30 doors, right? So, and this really ties into the point you are making, Icha, is the unpredictability of the field. This is not a framework where you can say, going in, that, oh, I know by the time I hit the 5th interview, I have my magic number and my magic rules. But so if I do 5 interviews, I will hit that jackpot. Because you might not, right? And again, that also ties in with this question of what counts as data saturation. Now, typically we say 35 is where you saturate your data, but that might not be the case, depending upon how the stories emerge. So that too is uncertain in some senses, because your actor being in the story, in the process of co-constructing the story, moves it in particular ways such that that might demonstrate to you specific links that you would need to follow, and that might mean that you might need to go beyond any magic number that limits you. So I want to come back to this notion, Icha, of labor and labor in the front end amidst uncertainty. So, for instance, you can have many ways of doing a CCA project. If you have a community partner, the community partner can help you identify. On the other hand, if you start a CCA project as an ethnography, like we did with the sex worker project, you start with an ethnography of on the streets. Now try imagining talking to sex workers on the street who are actually on the street because they want to make the money. They don't want to talk to you. Even to find that one person might take many hours of being in the field for many days at a go. Yes? So the question then, the impetus then, is not to turn away from that or to turn back from that to the position of privilege that I or you inhabit, but rather to take that as an impulse to keep going back. So that is the key part, because I think it's very easy in the front end when you say, okay, I'm not unable to gather the data, okay, I give up. You know what, this is too difficult, I don't know how to negotiate, and you can make up a bunch of excuses in your own head.
I give you an example of the first project I ever try to do in the field, right? So I thought at that time my IRB also needed to get an IRB in Nepal. So I had an IRB at Purdue. Everything is planned out. I went to Nepal. Apparently, I didn't need one, but I went to all these places to figure out to get an IRB. Spent most of my summer trying to do that. Finally, got my, this institution to get an IRB to be able to. But it wasn't really linked to the field. It's just that I don't know why I had the impression that I had to have IRB from 2 places to be able to do this. So I was on this thing of getting an IRB. So I go to the field, which is a community. Squatter community. So they've just kind of sprung up, right? And so imagine you just walk in and you're trying to get them to talk to you and to, you have your list of questions. And I'm so thrilled because I finally got my running around chasing my IRB. But, and then by that time, I'm there for a limited time in the summer. My summer has already been cut in half. I only have this much time, and then I go into the community, I observe, I talk to people, but it's very surface, right? There isn't anybody who's in there. They're happy to show the schools that they're building in there, the access they have, but nobody really wants to talk about them. And I make all these observations, I write all of these things, but I still have nothing. And so you think, oh my God, right? I'm leaving, and I'm leaving soon. Do I extend it? Do I do what? And then, I guess it's different here because you start with an objective. But for me, that was the first learning experience of really knowing myself in terms of how I am when I go into the field, and perhaps the perceptions I also present. But also the fact that, you go through all of this trouble, and I have nothing to show for it. And in the end, I have no study, no publication, nothing. That was just is what it is, and I see it and I have it in my file, but that's all it was. It's become a file, a letter that says I have this IRB approval to, and from 2 countries, right, from 2 places to say I can do, but it didn't matter, right? When I went to the community, they're so happy. I mean, they talked about things, right, but it wasn't really in terms of health. It wasn't really in terms, and you can see because it's a squatter community that how they have built, and they're happy to bring you to their house and show you how they're living, again. But it's nothing in terms of what that means to them, how they manage that, what it is. And the only thing I got a lesson from that is really this idea of, at that time we were thinking about family planning or reproductive health, and this guy looked up the billboard and he said, look at where I live and what I have to do, and look at that. Am I going to pay it? And there was this big sign about family planning and whatever else, and I said, you tell me, right? And then why I would pay attention when I'm thinking about sending my child, or what you see where I'm living, and what this is important in terms of there's no water there. I have to think, why do I pay attention to that, right? And so that was really my first experience in terms of the fact that and not to mention that if you talk about mess in terms of literal mess, right, and think about where I'm living, and I'm in a community which is dusty, it's dirty, I'm sitting on the floor. If you think about my clothes, I mean, it really is literally being in the mud in that sense, right? Being part of that and eating what they're eating and doing. But if you think about it from who I am, and that's not how I live and eat. But really, that I think is also swallowing your pride in some sense, right? And really being part of that environment in that sense. And the only reason that they were even willing to talk to me that much was because I was willing to be part of that environment and not sort of distance myself in a way that I look at it, and sort of from the top and say, oh, I don't really, if I sit here and right, is that clean? But they're boiling, they're eating, as the pot is what it is. It's there. If you open up that space, you accept it, and you think, am I going to get a stomach ache? And we go around teaching about sanitation, and here if I start doing those things, then what's the point? They're there. You're never going to build that trust, right? If this was my dissertation, of course, for my dissertation I spent like 7 months. I would different environment, going back, that's the point, you start to build that, right? What I missed out in was I was starting to build that kind of a every day going back and doing that 15 days, and I still have nothing, right? But then at that time I'm leaving, and so I have not, but then it gave me a different kind of a lesson. I have no publication, but it's okay. But it sort of shaped my self in a way that when I was planning for my dissertation, I was able to think of it in different ways and to really plan it in a way that really accounts for some of those things that right, nobody tells you about, or you don't think about until you put in that place and you realize, oh my God, this is
so part of this, Isha, is I think when you think about the front end of a culture-centered work, sort of figuring out whether you have it in you to do it or not,
Yeah.
right? Because if you don't want to get messy, you might as well go and do a few surveys, or you have tons of secondary data. Nobody's stopping you from going out and analyzing that and publishing your studies. I think that's very different kind of mentality, attitude, character, as Rati would put it. She has said that you have to have a particular kind of character to want to do CCA, and I think part of that character is the desire to go back into the field in the midst of messiness.
And swallow your right.
Swallow your own pride, I think, in some ways. Right?
Because it does. I mean, I could have really said that is a failure and I have nothing, and come back to.
Or you could have, even better, you could have turned to the community and said, this community, they don't respond
pointless.
to me. They are useless. They are on, government subsidies and funding. But people do that. It is us. We do that. We have that within our personalities to do that, and that can be a very easy way to turn away from the field.
Yeah. I think when I came back and I had only my reflections to give to Mohammed,
and I said that is okay,
yeah,
right?
It's okay, fine, it's fine. That's what I said. Okay.
But the point was what, that you tried, that you kept knocking at it.
Right, we can easily say it's a failure, but then it depends on what you set up to do, right? It's really is ultimately all about the publication. Yes, our life depends on it, but if that's all it is meant to do, then it's really...
And I will share this example, right, Isha? Like today as we were sharing this story of knocking on 30 doors, and somebody said, but I wouldn't want to do that because you didn't even get... I would at least want a few positive interviews out of that. But that's the point. You cannot control that when you do this. You cannot control that if you go and knock on 30 doors and you're going to hit 5. And if you pitch yourself to saying that, okay, my success or failure depends upon whether I am able to get, 5 out of 30 is what? 1/6. So that is 16% turnover rate, positive turnout rate. That is very limiting, right?
I mean, qualitative is already challenging, but then you throw CCA in there, it's like, double whammy in terms of the notion of messiness. I mean, I think it takes it even further because it's, it's going further than just collecting the data, right? So there is this idea of maybe resistance also in many levels of, it's not like just somebody coming in and going in. But at the same time, if you go to a community that has been exploited, where they just get data and you leave, and then
they wouldn't want to be.
And so then you want to work with them, and you say, "What, we're different, right?" I mean, do you shy away from them, or you say, okay, but they've had this and they don't understand, so we'll go to a fresh community, right? I mean, if the purpose is really it's that community and has to be done, and they're resistive, then it takes that much longer. But then, right, that's part of the deal, and you have to do that in order to really be able to then get to what you want to do. And those are things that you can never plan for. Even you can have brainstorming session for months, and you plan. When you go there, it's like. You only know when you get there. So that's the. But if you don't go with the plan, then you'll be all over the place, and it makes no sense either. So you have to have a plan,
but also be
allowing
willing to
for the
right? Let that plan go out the window. Yeah. Satvi, you were going to say something?
Yeah, just want to know your personal experience based on your research. At which point do you jeopardize your own personal safety when engaging with a particular community, especially with subjects that are pretty, where you're engaging with an environment that might not see your privilege as something they want to be part of? At which point would you jeopardize your personal safety? I think maybe an example that might relate is your project with the Assamese fighters, if I'm not wrong. At which point did you decide that this was worth it or not worth it in terms of as a scholar? Because I feel like but this is a question I'm asking simply because the project that I'm thinking about for my PhD would mean that I would be going to an environment where I might be putting my personal safety at jeopardy. So at which point would you draw this line?
I haven't been in that kind of a situation, but if it was me, right, there you can assume in terms of the community that there is maybe a issue of safety, but it's also again hard to know until you study the community, right?
And until
you understand that, and until you go there, and you can only then assess for yourself to what level you're comfortable. And if you are not comfortable, nobody is going to say you must complete this, right? If there is an issue where you feel like this cannot happen, and this is going back to that idea of uncertainty also, but because for all of us there's probably a different level of tolerance and different level of what we are comfortable with. So even if you think this community might be, that means you go in prepared, but until you go there and you have a conversation, you kind of see what is happening, it's hard to have a definite answer of what to do, right? Because then you would know yourself what needs to be done, because you see it and you know whether you're able to cope with it, manage it, is a way around it, or is it just like, oh my God, I really feel like I cannot, do this.
So we should take the first step with at least trying to engage with the community.
And so part of this, Satvir, is that you don't know it till you're there. And when that decision and that goes with most other things in our lives, right? When that situation of safety or lack thereof arises, that's when you negotiate at that point, at that moment, what you do, whether you want to carry on or whether you pick a particular course.
But I think at the same time too, right, there's one thing about being aware, but there's another thing about letting it cripple you, in the sense that you are always in fear that something's going to happen. Then it's like being, if you live your life being paranoid all the time, there's always something that's going to
come to think of it, there are many CCA projects. My Santali work is a good example of work that is done in the midst of a lot of threat, a lot of physical threat. If you think about Mahua's work with the farmers in Singur, where the farmers were organizing, it was done amidst threat because there was police violence, there was farmer resistance. If you think about Induk's work with farmer activists in South Korea, again there was threat because she was working with the activists. Activists were being taken and put to jail. But for none of us, threat works as a concept out there. Threat is real as it is lived in the field. And then, of course, that doesn't mean that we're oblivious to that threat, but rather the question is, once we are in the field, in that setting, and the threat becomes real, what we choose to do with it. So just as you talk about, my presence in a community where there are threats to health or threats to life, I can at the same time tell you that between 2008 and 2011, when there was large-scale Maoist violence and it had taken very large scale, where there were curfews and all that, I did not go into that same community. When I went back in 2011 and started initiating the contacts, it was after assessing again the extent to which I could be physically there in the community by being present. So all of this is to say that you negotiate that, but the negotiation again has to happen where? In the field, in the experience. You cannot, even I cannot sit here and draw out a map and do a risk assessment of what is the potential likelihood of violence in Punjab. No. So part of that is that by being present in that setting, then you're able to make that assessment.
But I will tell you one thing from my experience, that whatever we think it might be internal to us in terms of our feelings when we go into the community, we think it's just us, but people are not stupid. That's the whole point, right, of doing CCA, is also that it's not, yes, education gives you access and maybe you become more cynical in life and whatever else, but the idea is that, it doesn't mean that people who are living their life are also not able to understand something. So if you have this, you go, let's say, for example, into the community with this idea that there's fear and there's violence and that and you will, exhibit those unconsciously, even if you don't say it, in terms of your manner, in terms of the way you interact, and people pick up on that. And it's like a cycle, right? Sometimes you kind of bring that because people also read into that. So it's this idea of really being able to be mindful of yourself to the way that you kind of can let go. And really assess it as it is. That really, if there is an idea, there's threat, there's violence, it is because it's there and it's real. It's not imagined or felt because you have read about it.
Or mediatized through some other kind of narratives.
Yes. And so it's true for any kind of setting, is that you allow that to be because of that, in that sense, and whatever it is that you are, whatever kind, even sex work, even if it's migrant workers, it doesn't, right? So because in different settings, different sense of insecurity is there. And threat and violence in different forms. It doesn't always mean that it has to be a physical kind of a violence, right? That violence could be in different ways, where you just feel uncomfortable all the time in who you're working with, that it gives you a sense of really not being able to let your guard down. And that's the point, right? Is that if you cannot let your guard down, you also would not be able to move past that initial, just talk about this and that, and really not be able to move into the project. But if that stays with you, that also is an indication that really maybe you need to assess being there.
And the other part of that is, right, if there is violence, to what extent, when you find violence, to what extent you romanticize that? And part of that beingness is noticing the violence as it is at that moment, and seeing if you engage with it, if you can engage with it, if you have the capacity to engage with it in a meaningful way, and then finding a course of action. So in that sense, to the extent that we script that violence into romantic scripts, that again also fits into portrayals of that particular community in ways that delegitimize the community and the voice of community members. The other thing I was going to say, in that sense, that when you talk about messiness and uncertainty and being in the field, it seems like in most of culture-centered work, it is the field that takes up the space. You see, so when I envision a culture-centered project or a center to do culture-centered work, it is the field that I envision should be at the center, and it should all be about the field. In that sense, unfortunately, in communication, we are not trained into ethnography, right? But our life should be one of ethnographers, in a sense that when we think about theoretical questions, when we think about how to resolve theoretical issues, those kinds of resolutions should come through the field, through experiences in the field. So when we talk, Icha and I spend a lot of time talking to each other. When we talk to each other, it is our field, each of our field sites, that take up our conversations, that take up our collaborations. And that's why we continue to collaborate after, so many years. The same with Amber, because it is the field that brings us together and connects us. It is not reading some exotic text.
And in that sense, I think maybe it's different in the lab, right? Because you are doing I don't know, maybe it isn't so different, is that we also have our own take or interpretation of CCA, right? And this is why we have a continued conversation, because sometimes, I go in and say, but, right, this is how I see and this is what I do, and how is it? Right? And so this is this idea that it is not a formula that we can,
yes.
can
and
apply.
But that is driven by field again.
Yeah.
Right? When you bring that and you say, this is what I'm seeing in the field, and it isn't quite, holding, and then we can talk about, okay, these maybe are the boundary conditions. But you're right. So in that case, then, it is not a prescription. Right? It isn't a cookie cutter model where you say, oh, I do 20, like how our undergrad students want, right? Like with the thesis, oh, I do 20 interviews, 30 minutes to 40 minutes, I'm done, voila, I have a CCA project. No.
Yeah, sometimes it's 10 minutes interview and sometimes it's 2 hours, right? It just, not only in terms of the time, but I think also, and so when people ask me about CCA, I say, well, this is my take, this is my interpretation, and this is how I do it, and this is how I see it, because this is how I apply it in that sense.
So I have a question. This is what I found with the women farmers. So when the first I went to talk to them, they will give very brief answers, and the interview will be over in 5 to 10 minutes, right, because they know they think that you are here for just kind of vacation or something. So yeah, but if you've seen more often in participating in their programs and going along with them, then the next time they have more trust and are willing to sit with you for longer periods of time and talk their stories. So it's also like staying there and being visible and being part of the field, that you're here for more amount of time. You're not just like,
and it's a long-term commitment.
Yeah, I think that kind of builds a trust. And do you find the same thing, that earlier on they're just very quick answers and they always come up with some excuse?
I mean, I'll give you an example, JT. What does health mean to you?
Mm-hmm.
You will get really cryptic responses.
Exactly, yeah.
But even with that question, my presence in the field over a long period of time will open up different kinds of conversational threads.
Mm-hmm.
With that same question,
yeah.
what does health mean to you?
And
does that mean that, we should not ask that question? If you base it on the basis of the first few times you go out into the field and ask that question, you might have a very different experience than your engagement with that question at a different time, at a different level of presence in the field.
And so this is what I mean by my take or interpretation, right? Because when you can translate that and you ask it in Nepali, it's like, what in the world are you asking me, right? So I break it down in different ways and have different conversations. And sometimes it could be just like, I'm feeling this way today, and I just came back and I've been here for a week, and and so sometimes it's just, and then starts the conversation about your health in a way that really, this, they give you advice, especially if they're older women, they tell, give you advice and eat this, eat that, and so kind of rolls that,
yeah.
And I get to that point without really, because if I walk in and I say, and they just look at me like, where did you drop
Yes.
from, right? And so sometimes it could be that is all I want to know, but that could be probably comes an hour later after
Yes.
we've talked about everything
and framed in a very different way.
and framed in a different way. So it never. I said this is the way it must be. That I don't know. I don't know if your other advisor ever did that, but I guess I was never
Yes.
one to follow directions. So it worked perfectly for me because I never follow directions or anything in life. So I'd kind of bend it in the way it kind of
It
the way
fits within that
fits my
context.
personality and the way I think. So for me it it tends to work. So I don't think I ever have asked that question. But that's what we're trying to get at in many places, right? But
yeah, I also noticed that what do you mean by health, or what is the meaning of health? How do you define health? These questions usually are met with blank faces, or kind of like they can directly tell you that I'm confused. And usually, the everyday version of it becomes that. How do you keep your family members healthy?
Yes.
Yeah, and then they start to talk about all kinds of different stories. And then messiness to me also means, when Dr. Dada and Licha talks about this, after long years of collaboration, still talk about the empirical richness of this ethnographic research. Messiness in that sense also translates into a plethora of knowledge or richness of information. That is, really the attraction of ethnographic work. Yeah.
But I think just a few weeks ago, I was in Mohan's office and we were talking about CCA and kind of the maturity or the changes it has gone through since the time I used it for my dissertation to what you guys are doing, and my impressions and kind of that, and then and of course you can get him heated up pretty quickly in terms of CCA and but Icha, and so but then that's what kind of gets and so but Mohan, right, and then it's kind of, but that kind of a, it's not like because this is but I have a different interpretation of it because I was at a different time when we were thinking about CCA, so I look at it quite differently, and then say somebody else who does it, so it's like and then you actually, if you read each other's papers on different phases, you see those reflections in how we actually make those things, but in terms of our own growth too, we take that from that point, and then probably so people who are always in the field for CCA have a very different understanding for the projects that you might end up running than where I began with when we were just talking about CCA in a sort of a different classroom and thinking about how you were thinking about growing it in a different ways and really the tensions of CCA and working that, right? So different, and so even if we have a conversation, we will have a different conversation because we have different understandings of it in many ways.
And part of that, Isha, when we were talking about that, was also identifying the boundary conditions. And I think any kind of approach or framework should have boundary conditions, meaning that everything in life cannot be studied from CCA. So I don't think we should try to fit anything that we look at from a CCA framework. So it's important to identify what those boundary conditions are, where a theory does not hold true, or where the theory might not apply.
Or with your own sense of, right, in terms of, and I think because I've known Daniel the longest and have this conversation multiple times and refer back to our other conversation about my interpretation of CCA being a methodology, being an approach, being a theoretical framework, different ways of actually using it. And in terms
so
of
you have to define clearly
Yes.
when you're doing it how you're taking CCA and how you're applying it. So and that's not just for writing the papers, that comes a lot later, but even when you're starting, are you taking the culture, structure, agency part of it, and that's what you're going to focus on? Or are you going to focus on the subaltern studies aspect of it in terms of co-constructing with erased voices? Or are you going to treat it as a methodology in terms of reflexivity and working through reflexivity with participatory processes? Right? Or are you going to develop an application out of it?
Voices, right? Sometimes it's just that you just want stories. It has nothing to do other than really using a cultural framework to get to those stories.
And it could be all of it.
It could be all of it.
It could be all of it. Yeah. Of course it could. And it often is in projects that happen over very long
Yes.
courses of time. So Ambar's project with sex workers, I think it's pretty comprehensive. In a sense that it is all of it, because the method constantly keeps pushing theory. But I think this part is really important when we talk about these issues of transparency, negotiating trust, uncertainty. A being the part about dissing the people that you interview. That does tend to happen. When you bring in your own lens and you look down upon the person that you're interviewing.
So
when you do that, be mindful of it. Rather than being defensive, A, be mindful of it. B, let that work on you. What does it say about you when you judge someone? What does it say about your own lenses, perhaps about your own privilege? That's very powerful when that happens, because then that's telling you something about your own. That tells me something. When I find myself doing that, that's a very powerful moment, and it's important for me to jot that down, because that is like an aha moment. Or Abid, for you, for instance, when you're going and documenting the migrant workers, when you're referring to them as them, right? That is a point of privilege. Be mindful of that. What does it mean when, for instance, they become them and you become the savior? Right? That through your lens, you're saving them. That is a privilege. Be mindful of that and then let that work on you. Or when you are doing these interviews with healthcare access, if you come in there and think, okay, these people are talking about access, they seem to have a lot of access, and yet they seem to be really like the welfare mom typology, right? That they are lazy bags. They are using the system. Okay, if you have noted that, be mindful of it. Then work on it. What does that say about you? Because into that script, then, when you have responded like that, what it is bringing out is a history that locates you vis-a-vis the person you just interviewed. What became aware within that short moment is a history that you inherit, that has made you who you are and made that person who they are.
So I had a conversation today about my one of my projects and talking about stories of women, and so the person said, do you go in with all your research questions? I mean, your interview guy. Yes, I do. Do you ask that question to everybody? I said, not sometimes, but then how do you get consistency across the stories? And I went, what consistency? That's the whole point. Sometimes, and so I didn't say anything, but that is a certain kind of a mindset, right? In terms of what you're looking for, that idea that you have is, and I was thinking, but that's not the point. That's what I'm trying to tell you is what
But
I'm
these are from
doing,
people
right?
that think they know CCA.
But
See, that's the other part. So, you see, and that's the desire to turn CCA into a script, right? Where it's a scripted set of methods. Somehow people think that, okay, Mohan, can you give me a cheat sheet with steps, procedures, protocols, questions? I will take this and replicate it.
But
The point is you can't, because as Rati says, it's part of your character. So I guess the question Rati puts it is that either you can or you cannot do CCA. If you cannot build your character to be that, you cannot do this method. And I think that's pretty discriminatory in some senses, because it rules out a bunch of people saying that you are not capable of doing CCA. But I think that's pretty powerful, because it is saying that this is about a mind frame, an attitude, a philosophy, a way of being methodologically as a researcher.
But teacher, now I can get into the conversation in the sense that there can be consistency because they're sharing the same kind of space. So, for example, with the women farmers, their consistency about what constitutes health for them, and I guess.
But you're not asking the same question.
Right.
You might not. You're not about asking the same set of questions to
every single woman.
Pauline.
Right. Okay. But they can be consistency.
Yes. So consistency comes out through the narratives because
right.
of what is happening in the discussion, not because I'm asking each person the same questions.
Right.
And making sure
So
I
it
ask
is
the
not
question
a
so I
frame
can.
that is pushed onto them.
Yes.
Yeah,
But it's a frame that emerges.
Yeah.
But also part of this is, so when we have a protocol, we do have a protocol. But when you have seen me in action in the field, do we stick to the protocol?
No, we go on from the responses. It's
Yes.
more like
Exactly.
based what are the rather than okay that's done and next what's the next question on my sheet. So I have some other question, but I can hold on if other people have.
Can't even
Questions? Yeah, I'm thinking that in terms of not only not looking for, or maybe sometimes do look for consistency, we are actually also telling this story of the field. But then at moment of contradictions, contradictory storytelling, or even the same person contradicting himself at the end of the conversation versus at the beginning of the conversation, we need to also ask a question of why, in what context basically doing that. For example, I have this field experience that from the very beginning when I asked about this health and care, and then he talked about this care as part of the Chinese traditional value does not exist anymore. So he referred to filial piety. He said that it as moral standards is dwindling. But then later on, another person asked him about I don't think so. Filial piety is still the Chinese traditional culture, and it's the very essence of it. And then he comes back to say that it is still very prominent in our village. So actually, this guy, the same guy, has two different kinds of account of filial piety. And then later on, when I analyzed this data, I realized that actually the first one, when he was referring that the moral standards was dwindling, he was actually referring to this large structural level that when his two sons went to the cities to work, and then he's thinking about his future, that his sons are not going to pay the same kind of filial duties to him. But then when that same peer is talking about that, they are referring to their actions towards their parents. So back to the village practices that actually it exists, and it's actually our village is doing the exemplary work.
So these are very different frames.
Yeah, very different frames, but
same issue.
Yeah, same issue, and then they happen in a sense that these frames do not manifest themselves. And you have to figure this out, sometimes by directly asking them. So I find that's fascinating, because that, yeah, when you find contradictions, yeah, think about it, and it can be emerging place of new knowledge. That's my take.
So one of the things that I have found, Kang, is that interviews can be very different. Interview A can be different from B, can be very different from C, right?
Yes.
So some interviews can be really fluid, that can flow and the story can build. And some interviews, you're struggling to even get some words out.
And it's just
I even
a
noticed
personality
But
too.
that is part of the field.
Yeah.
That is part of the experience in the field. But the question is, what do you take away from that? Right? Do I watch JT do that and see JT do a really fluid interview? And then say, oh, JT had a good time because it was an easy interview, this person was really talkative. Or do I take a lesson from that in terms of this idea that how interviews flow can depend upon the trajectory and how you're into it or one with it, right?
Yes.
And what that means is that I might have a good day where an interview is really fluid and it really builds, and I might have a really bad day, or two interviews back to back
Yes.
might be that different. While the
Yeah,
second
exactly.
interview, the person isn't really talking, they aren't really sharing, they aren't really saying things. But that too also is a reflective moment.
Yes. Also happens that after the interview you can be really depressed, and then you feel that you have a bad day, but then later on you reflect on this, you have some real findings. For example, when I was talking about this healthcare issue, and then it's a large group meeting, and then they talked about this farm work, and then they refer to this apple orchard, because that village is this, each family has apple orchard. But then I just asked them, when it's the flowering, the blossom season, then you just you don't do nothing. You just go there and then observe the beautiful sceneries, and then they talked to me like from, it's almost like a farm, orchard farming 101 or something. That they say that each flower, it's a cluster of flowers of 7, and then you have to pick all the rest of the 6, and only let 1 remain. So basically, that they do this repeated work for 1 tree. It can be like several hours, and then in the end, they will say that it's aching all over. And then in that way, they explained it to me. And then because that's the village where I grew up, so one member of the extended family talked to me directly, saying that, oh, it's so hard to talk with you about our farmland, meaning that you are offspring from this same village, and you are asking these stupid questions, and you are like a cultural tencoat. And then it's like before, in front of 17 people, and I felt this, so blushed, and then I felt so embarrassed. But later on, when I looked at this kind of this part of data, I was thinking that, how about, does it say something true about everyone who goes to college after living in a village for a long time? Does that also say something about these peasant workers who go to their cities at a fairly young age and stay in the cities for 10 years without coming back to even observe the apple flowers in blossom, or let alone to help pick the flowers? So it becomes a part of the experience of this elder generation.
Yeah, the similar experience. The women farmer, I was trying to explain that I'm not a doctor of health, neither am I a doctor of animals. She was saying, oh, that's so sad. At least if you have learned some agriculture, you would have been able to survive. And she was making fun of that my knowledge is nothing in the agriculture field.
You know, Icha said something, I really thought that was so interesting. When you said how your interview plays out is also a reflection of what you bring to the table, right? So if you're judging, the person that you're interviewing will be able to tell. You know, if you are looking at them condescendingly, trust me, they will be able to tell. So part of this also is when we say, you know, reflect on your own attitudes. I need to reflect on mine. Icha needs to reflect on hers. Right? Part of this is recognizing when you do that, and also recognizing that that actually plays out in how you do the interview and what comes out in the interview. Have you seen that happen?
Yeah, right.
You know, I remember Nadine used to do this because Nadine's project was with this social welfare program, Women and Children. As you know, in America, the narrative on welfare moms is a predominant narrative that they are immoral, they are not hardworking, they are not committed to the family, they keep on having babies so that they can be on welfare. So Nadine told me at one time, so she would go out and do these interviews, and we used to do this often, right? And she would come back and we would have a long conversation about, you know, what her field experience was like. And she was like, Mohan, I just can't help but judge some of these women. Because I'm thinking, you know, you have 4 kids, you cannot take care of them, you're on welfare, how come you're pregnant again? And she was like, I can't help but judge them. And so part of her working through that was working through this idea that her tendency was one to judge them, not understanding their rationality as to how they could want to have a 5th kid and be pregnant with the 5th kid when they are struggling to manage with 4 kids.
It really makes a difference, because it also changes not only your, you know, body language and expressions, but your tone, the way you ask a question, how involved you get with them, how you hold back, right? I mean, all of those plays out, and when you can interact freely and openly is when you get the response, aside from the fact that they've seen you multiple times and they say, okay, this person is not so bad and I can have a conversation. But then they start having a conversation and they feel like you really are there just, you know, you really, in some ways, confirm their suspicion of you, right, in that way, because you haven't managed to kind of move yourself past that boundary.
So during the interviewing, one has to let go of having control over on the interview process.
And your own reaction, right? Sometimes, like in terms of the fact that you might, it's not to say, and Mohan might like hit me over the head with this, that just because it's CCA doesn't mean you cannot get angry and upset and really be like, oh, you know, just, but then it's not your place, right? Then that's part of the reflection is for you to come back and say, why is it that just got me so like, upset
and then
about
reflect
this,
on that emotion.
upset about this? Is there something in it that really is, you know, needs to be, and then maybe, and sometimes, you know, you might go back and really try to figure that with the next interviewee who might have no inclination whatsoever of what you're trying to get, but you're trying to figure out that tension, or what is it is it something that's across the board, is it one person, what is it that gets you in that sense? But it's not to say at the moment, you know, but I think sometimes, and I have done this, right? Sometimes you say, really? I mean, how is it? Why? And I kind of show that, right? And say, not that I'm judging them, but like, can you just help me understand?
Yes, I can't understand. I
cannot picture it. I cannot understand it.
Yes.
Can you help me understand your position or your situation? It's not that I'm saying, oh my God, you're just stupid, right? And then it's like, but more like, okay, I might be feeling that, but I'm trying to still kind of not be that, right? And say, just help me understand what it is that you are thinking, doing, saying, feeling. What is it that drives you to do this as opposed to that, or whatever it is? So you try to get to that question as opposed to, you know, feeling frustrated. And because if we feel frustrated, then we kind of move back to asking questions and really understanding what might be going on. And so, I for sure do get in that, but then I do channel it in a different way in terms of what that does for me.
Yeah, it's just I'm sorry, this is very exciting, but I have an appointment, like I need to get ready.
You have an appointment too, right?
So one quick question. So how do you manage these messiness with the sort of the policies out here that you can only spend certain amount of time in the field? Do you have that problem back when you're doing your?
Wait, say that again?
There are only certain days you can be away in the field, and then.
Yeah, but she had even lesser.
Oh, okay.
You get 90 days.
Yeah.
We get much lesser than that, right?
So are you saying how do I manage my time if I only have
90 days,
right?
to be able to get
Be
the
in the
interviews?
field.
Yeah, be in the field, get to know the people, and do the interviews.
I know that's right. Sometimes it's not about how much time you spend. It sometimes really is about meeting that right person in that field who allows you to kind of becomes your advocate or helps you network, and if you need that one person to say, hey, it's okay, kind of open that up, and sometimes then you wait and it happens on the 15th day and you're leaving, and that's what I was saying. Like
then you come back.
And then you come back or you extend, and you sometimes, that's what I say, now I don't say how long it is, I just say I'm going, right? Because it really, I don't,
So I think part of that, JT, and we kind of figured it out, is to do it in chunks. You do it in 10-15 days, you give it your best, try to do as much, then come back
right.
again,
because that also shows
and
that
go back again.
Right, that you are interested, that you're committed, that you're coming back.
Yeah.
And so sometimes this is what I suggest for my PhD student who's thinking about a 2-year kind of extended in the field, is keep going back.
Yeah.
Don't say I'm going to go and stay in the field. Be realistic, right? First of all, your life you cannot put on hold for 2 years, but then it's no longer anthropology, ethnography like it happened in 2 years, where you actually go and live in a mountaintop for 2 years or whatever, right? You cannot. But then it also shows your commitment because you keep coming back, you keep doing that. So it's like, for like CCA project that you want to build over long term, I would suggest that. For me, I haven't really planned anything for a year or 2 years. It really is in small pieces, so it's easier to do that. But then that also sets the tone for the next project, or whether you can build something from there. And for me, really, that was sort of the way into the next project that I'm thinking about, right? So sometimes it serves a different purpose as to why you might just.
And the setting can be very different, right? So when we are doing projects in Singapore, that setting is very different as opposed to when we are doing projects in India.
Right.
So for thinking about projects in India, you have to ration it that way, and also hopefully find a local research partner. So like for instance with my project in Bengal, and that has taken so many routes, I'm able to go, thankfully being in Singapore, I'm able to go every 3-4 months for 10 days, and then maybe for a month in summer.
Okay.
But then I have local researchers who are there in that field site constantly all the time. So with the women farmers, if you have a women farmer who comes on as a co-researcher, that increases their presence also.
Yeah.
But this is idea of knowing yourself and knowing the field too. Even before I met Mohan, my first field experience was was doing an summer internship for an organization in Nepal, right? And so they were going into the field. And then they only told me this afterwards. The team, they were like, "Oh, there's this kid, right, who comes from the US, who wants to go in the field," and they're like, everybody's like, "Okay, we don't really want to deal with this person, right?" And then, right, when I was in the field, I was in the field. I ate, I slept, and sometimes I just had to swallow and close my eyes, and really close my eyes until I couldn't, and because it's hard to sometimes adjust to the environment in some ways, but really, right, being in that moment, just kind of. And not to say I'm being a different person or to differentiate from where I am, but to really live in that place in the sense of what is going on, so that later on they're like, oh, we're so surprised that actually you can do this, right? You are okay to do that, and it wasn't so everybody was like, do we have to, right? And then I said, okay, I'm kind of glad that you came along. It was not this impression that I'm going to just always look at the field from afar and then sort of say, okay, this is not right, this is not good, and place my judgment, or to even go into the community and to talk to the women, to sort of be maybe judgmental, or even to sort of be standoffish or whatever, right? But I was in there, and so it was also, I guess, my realization of whether you are cut out for something like that. Right, in that sense.
And I want to add the other part of it is that so you can be present in the field at certain times, right? But when you own the field, in terms of not owning the field, but you take ownership of your relationship with the field. Even when you're not in the field, you're in the field. Because your access, your joy, your exhilaration is not here. Right? Your solidarity is not here.
Yeah.
Like my solidarity with Icha, it is here, but it is not really here. Our relationship is borne out through our relationship in the field. You see, so in that sense, you come to inhabit the field much more so spatially rather than just physically.
Right.
Do you feel that?
What, that the field is always with you?
Again, in some way,
You carry some sand from the field in your pocket all the time.
Yeah. Right?
But
it
in
does.
terms of concepts, right?
It changes you every time, and you learn something, and then you become, I don't know, you allow, I think it's not, that's the difference in CCA and why I myself, right, engage in CCA project. It's not because, Mohan's twisting my arm in the back by any means. It's just the idea that I grow each time. I change each time. I see a different perspective, and I have that, right?
Yeah.
So it's that sense, I think, that keeps me going and kind of using that. When using.
Thank you. Hold on.
The ability to
Hello, hi.
also allow yourself to grow and learn in that every time.
No, you're correct.
Go for it, come.
Okay, thank you.
See you later.
Great.
Do you need to go inside soon?
Yes.
What time is it? Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks a lot,
sharing
Icha.
Yeah, you're
Yeah,
welcome.
hopefully.